At 3:47 in the morning, the world was still. Most people were asleep, and the sky above the planet looked the same as it always had. Quiet, distant, indifferent. Then something hit the night like a shock wave. Around the globe, radio telescopes began to pick up a pulse so powerful it didn't just cut through the cosmic background noise. It drowned it out completely, like someone had reached into the universe and turned the volume knob to maximum. At first, scientists tried to do what scientists always do. Blame the equipment, blame interference, blame a solar event, blame anything that kept reality inside the boundaries of what made sense. But the signal refused to behave like a mistake. It had structure. It repeated with precision. It carried layers of patterning that looked less like random noise and more like intention, like a message built to survive distance, translation, and disbelief. And when the deeper packets were decoded, a chill moved through the rooms where the data was being read, because hidden inside the transmission were coordinates. Not coordinates pointing back to Earth. Coordinates pointing outward, scattered across the galaxy like marked doors. That's when a name resurfaced, sliding through encrypted channels and whispered conversations between people who don't usually whisper. 31. Atlas. The object humanity believed it had started to understand. The interstellar visitor. The strange presence that seemed to watch, to hover at the edge of our certainty, as if it had been observing our world and quietly managing something we couldn't see. Tonight, it wasn't managing anymore. Tonight, it was broadcasting across every band of the electromagnetic spectrum, and the scale of it didn't feel like communication. It felt like activation, because the most disturbing part wasn't the raw power. It was what that power started doing to us. Satellites drifted into behaviors they weren't programmed for. Radio towers began resonating at frequencies they were never designed to touch. Networks didn't fail the way technology fails when it breaks. They shifted, the way a system shifts when it's being tuned. It was as if Earth itself had been grabbed by the circuitry. Our communications grid, satellites, towers, cables, transmissions, stopped behaving like human infrastructure and started behaving like components in something larger, a planetary amplifier, a relay beacon, a mouth. And the data stream kept going, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat you couldn't silence. When the final portion of the transmission was finally translated into something readable, the words didn't land like a greeting or a warning. They landed like a status report. The network is complete. Begin convergence. In that moment, the real question arrived. Not, what is this, but who is this for? Because everything about the signal felt wrong in a specific way. Like it wasn't meant to be received by humanity at all. Like we were never the audience. We were the instrument. And if this was an invitation, then Earth wasn't being contacted. Earth was being opened. So now you're left staring at the same dilemma, because it's the only one that fits the shape of what just happened. Are we the chosen ones? Or are we the experiment? Because what happened next wasn't silence drifting back through space. What happened next was the universe answering, fast, coordinated, and like it had been waiting for this signal the entire time. The first hours after the pulse were the strangest, not because the world immediately fell into panic, but because it didn't. A hush settled over everything, the kind you only notice when you've lived your whole life surrounded by constant noise. No government announcement, no unified headline, no official warning sirens. And yet, in observatories and monitoring stations across the planet, the same instinct kept surfacing in different minds at the same time. This wasn't over. The signal had the weight of a first knock on a door you didn't even know existed. And Earth, whether we wanted to admit it or not, had just heard it. Then the second knock came. Except it didn't sound like feedback, or random interference, or a cosmic echo returning from empty space. It came back as structure, intention, response. The same arrays that had been struggling to isolate the original transmission suddenly began registering returns from deep space. Clean, deliberate packets arriving from multiple directions, multiple distances, and with a timing so tight it made the word coincidence feel childish. These weren't stray civilizations stumbling onto a loud broadcast and replying out of curiosity. These were coordinated confirmations, as if the first pulse had activated a network that was already awake, already organized, already waiting for the exact key that 31 Was Atlas had just turned. What made it worse wasn't just that the replies existed, but how they behaved. Each incoming response carried its own distinct fingerprint, different harmonic textures, different geometric rhythms, different mathematical accents. Yet they all shared a common cadence that looked like protocol. Prime progressions repeating with the same intervals, harmonic stacks that aligned like a signature, a shared grammar beneath different dialects. It was as if 17 separate voices had answered the call, each unique, but all reciting the same oath. And as scientists compared the data streams, one grim conclusion solidified without anyone having to say it out loud. These intelligences already knew each other, not in theory, in practice, in coordination. The galaxy hadn't just heard something. The galaxy had RSVP'd. As deeper layers of the original transmission were decoded and overlaid with the returning signals, the story sharpened into something far more chilling than first contact. The packets weren't filled with wonder or questions or greetings. They carried approach vectors, orbital windows, atmospheric compatibility tables, and a phrase that kept resurfacing like a stamped watermark: arrival synchronization protocol. Then came the number that turned every room cold: 73 days. It wasn't presented as a possibility or a projection. It was framed like a schedule, like a countdown that had already started the moment Earth became a relay, and now the rest of the network was simply aligning to it. That's when the tone of the entire event shifted. Mystery became logistics. Curiosity became timing. Because an unknown intelligence existing out there is a frightening idea you can keep at arm's length. But a timetable is different. A timetable points at your calendar, your cities, your oceans, your sky, and tells you the unknown is not theoretical anymore. It's incoming. And the term embedded in the stream, multi-species convergence, didn't read like poetry. It read like a title on a classified file. Not a visit, not a conversation, an event. Multiple intelligences arriving to a single world within the same window under shared coordination, like a system doing exactly what it was built to do. And while the world stared upward at the concept of it, something even more disturbing began to happen down here. The background hum of our own infrastructure started to change. Communication bands that should have remained stable began to oscillate as if they were being tuned. Networks that weren't designed to resonate started behaving like instruments being brought into alignment. Systems didn't fail the way machines normally fail. Burned circuits, blown relays, dead screens. They fell quiet like they'd been overridden, as if their purpose had been reassigned. It wasn't the sensation of technology breaking. It was the sensation of technology surrendering control to something more fluent in its language than we had ever been. In that moment, a new thought pressed itself into the story like a knife. What if 31 Atlas was never here to observe humanity at all? What if it had always been here to prepare the planet? Because the speed of the responses, the shared protocol, the precision of the alignment, it all suggested that the call wasn't a desperate attempt to reach the stars. It was a trigger within an existing system, a key used on a lock the universe had already built. And if Earth had become the beacon, then the replies weren't the beginning of a conversation. They were confirmations that the next phase had already been accepted. So the question stopped being, Who are they? And became something far more unsettling. What are we? Because you don't get scheduled like this unless you're already part of the plan. You don't receive synchronized approach vectors unless your world has been designated for something. And when you realize the galaxy didn't answer in chaos but in chorus, you're forced to confront the possibility that the invitation was never a gamble. It was a step, one that only needed Earth to reach a certain threshold before the countdown could begin. By the time most people realized anything unusual had happened, the world had already been repurposed. Not conquered in the cinematic sense. No sirens, no explosions, no visible invaders in the streets, but converted. Quietly, elegantly, almost politely. The engineers who first noticed it described the same sensation in different words. The planet's systems weren't failing the way machines fail. They were behaving the way instruments behave when someone else takes control of the tempo. Satellites that should have been discrete objects obeying predictable commands began acting like synchronized nodes. Radio towers that should have broadcast human voices started carrying harmonics that no human had authorized. Even fiber networks, buried, shielded, designed for speed and privacy, began registering subtle rhythmic signatures like a heartbeat traveling through glass. It was the kind of takeover that didn't announce itself as violence. It announced itself as competence. Any attempt to isolate the phenomenon only revealed how deeply it had already spread. When a tower was shut down, it didn't silence the signal. It simply moved, as if the signal had never been dependent on the tower in the first place. When a satellite's uplink was cut, the satellite didn't go dark. Another pathway surfaced, an unseen relay, a subspace detour that felt less like hacking and more like a system revealing its true architecture. The terrifying implication wasn't that 31 Atlas had broken our networks. It was that our networks had been waiting to be used this way all along, like we'd built a piano and only now discovered who could really play it. Then came the decoded content, and that's where the story turned from strange to personal. At first, scientists hoped the transmissions were just coordinates, abstract signals meant for beings who lived too far away to matter to us. But as the packets were unpacked, the language became brutally familiar. Inventories, surveys, protocols. The first stream read like a ledger of Earth itself, not as a home, but as an asset. Mineral deposits enumerated with a precision that made every human map look primitive. Atmospheric stability indices that treated breathable air like a line item. Energy reserves classified the way a corporation might classify fuel, not the way a civilization might describe its future. If you listened to it long enough, you could almost feel the psychological shift happening in real time. The way the mind recoils when it realizes it's being viewed not as a subject with dreams, but as a resource with potential. The second stream was worse because it didn't treat Earth as an object. It treated us as variables. Human populations reduced into genetic diversity charts, behavioral patterns, social cohesion ratings, cold, clinical, intimate. And buried inside those biological surveys was a phrase that made even hardened analysts stop breathing for a second: compliance potential. It was the kind of labeling that doesn't emerge from curiosity. It emerges from management, from planning, from a system that doesn't ask what you want, but calculates what you'll do once the environment around you changes. In those hours, a new fear began spreading beneath the scientific data, quiet but contagious. This wasn't contact, this was assessment, and assessments aren't made unless there's already an agenda. The third stream sealed the dread into something heavier than speculation. It was a report, not about the galaxy, but about our infrastructure, what had been successfully converted, what had been integrated, what had been optimized. Dates appeared. Regions appeared, Efficiency scores appeared, like some vast intelligence had been running silent diagnostics on humanity for longer than anyone wanted to admit. The phrase planetary optimization surfaced again and again with a kind of calm certainty, and the number attached to it made the room feel smaller. 98% complete. Not in progress, not attempting. Complete. As if whatever we thought we were doing with our civilization, our wars, our economies, our debates, our elections, had always been happening inside a larger operation that didn't require our permission to proceed. And then the transmission stopped being abstract entirely, because the final upload wasn't a survey or an inventory. It was a schedule. Landing zones mapped across continents with the kind of confidence that makes you understand the difference between a visitor and an administrator. The zones weren't chosen as if someone was looking for safe ground. They were chosen as if someone already owned the blueprint. Each location was tagged with a distinct sigil, a marker that implied assignment. Different incoming civilizations matched to different territories, like partitions on a grid. In that moment, the illusion of human sovereignty didn't collapse with drama. It simply evaporated, like mist under a rising sun. The broadcasts weren't asking for a seat at the table. They were redesigning the room. Within a day, governments didn't need to speak publicly for the world to sense the shift. Communications between capitals tightened, then thinned, then went dark. Not from sabotage, but from a kind of quiet admission that there was no narrative capable of containing what was happening. Military systems didn't mobilize the way they do when they believe victory is possible. Instead, orders changed tone. Networks that had been built for defense began redirecting into something that sounded absurdly bureaucratic until you understood the terror behind it. Coordination, arrival management, transition protocols, soldiers reassigned into roles that didn't resemble warfare at all, not because they'd been defeated in battle, but because the concept of battle no longer fit the situation. You can't fight something that's already turned your entire planet into its instrument. And above it all, steady as a metronome, the signal continued pulsing. Calm, patient, unhurried. Not the voice of an invader raging at a locked gate, but the voice of a system confirming the gate has already been opened. Every hour that passed made one truth harder to deny. Whatever was coming wasn't improvising. It was arriving on schedule. The galaxy had answered the invitation. Earth had become the antenna, and humanity was about to discover whether we were the honored recipients of a cosmic calling or the carefully prepared environment for an experiment that began long before we ever learned to look up. At first, the world tried to understand the invitation in familiar terms, because familiar terms are how the human mind protects itself. People reached for the oldest categories: invasion, colonization, conquest, war. Even the language on the news, what was left of it, kept circling the same desperate assumptions, because those assumptions at least preserved a sense of agency. If this was an enemy, then there could be defenses. If this was a threat, then there could be negotiations. If this was an attack, then there could be an end. But the deeper the signal was decoded, the clearer it became that none of those categories fit. The message didn't carry the emotional heat of hostility. It carried the cold clarity of procedure. And that, more than anything, was what made it frightening. Because hostility is reactive. Procedure is planned. When the linguists finally broke through the thicker layers, past the obvious coordinates and the technical scaffolding, they expected to find a political demand, some cosmic ultimatum. Instead, they found a project name. Not a declaration, not a threat, not a boast, a label, the way an institution labels its work when it's been doing it for a very long time. Consciousness Development Initiative. The phrase landed in the room like a weight, not because it was poetic, but because it was methodical. It suggested a program, a history, a timeline. It suggested that whatever had been happening around Earth wasn't random observation or curiosity, but something closer to a controlled study, ongoing, organized, measurable. The implications spilled out slowly, because the human mind doesn't like to accept the idea that it might be a subject before it is a citizen. The decoded fragments described Earth in a way that made every patriotic story feel suddenly small. Not as a home world in the sentimental sense, but as a site, a test environment, a platform. And humanity wasn't framed as a species being contacted for diplomacy. Humanity was framed as an emergent variable being tracked for performance. Even the way the transmission spoke about emotion and creativity felt less like admiration and more like evaluation, as though what we call love and grief and inspiration weren't sacred experiences, but rare data points, valuable precisely because they were difficult to replicate elsewhere. That was the moment the old question, "Are we chosen?" began to split into a darker twin. Are we selected, or are we sampled? Because the signal didn't talk about human consciousness the way a spiritual teacher would talk about it, and it didn't talk about it the way a conqueror would talk about a resource either. It spoke like a research consortium discussing a phenomenon that had proven unusually fruitful. Human awareness, it said, was rare in its blend. Emotional resonance, narrative imagination, the capacity for self-reflection that turns an organism into a storyteller, a dreamer, a creature that can suffer meaning, and then rebuild meaning from the ruins. The transmission described these traits the way a scientist describes conditions in an experiment that keep producing surprising results, not precious, not holy, useful. And the more they translated, the more the structure revealed itself. 17 separate responders. Not a single empire. Not one civilization claiming ownership. A network, coordinated enough to answer within hours, disciplined enough to use the same mathematical cadence, diverse enough to carry distinct signatures, yet united in purpose. Each responder, the transmission suggested, specialized in a branch of consciousness research, not in weapons, not in territory, in states of mind, in perception, in emotional architecture, in cooperative cognition, in what it called transcendence acceleration, a phrase that sounded almost benevolent until you understood how easily acceleration can become erasure if the subject doesn't get a choice. That's when the phrase Earth-designated operational base stopped sounding like an ominous line and started sounding like a diagnosis. An operational base isn't a destination you visit once. It's a location you use repeatedly. It's a place you equip, calibrate, staff, and maintain. It's a hub. And the presence of landing zones, mapped, allocated, tagged, wasn't the staging of a war. It was the staging of an installation. Earth wasn't being approached like a battlefield. It was being approached like a facility. Yet even inside that dread, there was an uncomfortable seduction. Because the transmission didn't promise annihilation, it promised evolution. It implied that the arriving civilizations didn't intend to destroy humanity, but to guide it beyond its current limits, to pull it out of its adolescence and into something like membership, participation in a larger field of intelligence, a galactic exchange of awareness. The invitation didn't read submit, it read transcend, evolve, become. And that's what made it so psychologically dangerous. An invitation to become more than human can feel like salvation to a species exhausted by its own history. It can also be the cleanest way to recruit a planet without ever needing to fire a shot. Still, there was a cost embedded in the beauty, and the transmission didn't bother to hide it. Individuality, it implied, was a developmental stage, a temporary configuration, a useful illusion for learning, like childhood is useful, but not meant to last. The idea struck at the deepest human instinct, The one that whispers, even when you're alone, that you are a singular I, moving through time, collecting memories, guarding your private inner world. The signal didn't ridicule that instinct. It treated it like scaffolding that would be removed once the structure was complete. And suddenly the question wasn't whether humanity would survive physically. The question was whether we would survive psychologically, whether we would still recognize ourselves after the upgrade we never asked for. Then the timeline arrived, and time itself became a pressure inside the story. 73 days. Not a poetic number, not a symbolic one, an operational interval, a countdown to convergence. Every hour that passed after that felt different, as though the planet had been put on a moving walkway toward an endpoint no one could step off. The fear wasn't loud, but it was pervasive. A constant background awareness that something was approaching with the patience of a system that has done this before. And that's when the strangest reports began to surface. Not from telescopes, but from bodies. Subtle changes that didn't feel like sickness, but didn't feel like health either, as if the boundary between mind and environment was thinning. People described flashes of insight that arrived fully formed, like thoughts that didn't originate from their own memories. Entire communities reported shared dreams, not in the vague sense of coincidence, but with matching details, matching symbols, matching emotional tones, as though a single narrative had been broadcast into sleeping minds. Neuroscientists argued, skeptics scoffed, spiritualists celebrated, and somewhere beneath the debate, something kept happening anyway. The human brain, at scale, was beginning to resonate. The first time researchers compared global EEG patterns against the frequencies embedded in the 31 Atlas transmission, they expected noise. What they found instead was alignment. Small, statistically significant at first, then undeniable. Peaks in neural oscillation matching the same harmonic structures that had hijacked our satellites. The effect didn't look like manipulation in the obvious sense. It looked like tuning, like a choir being brought into pitch. And if that was true, it meant the invitation wasn't only traveling through our machines, it was traveling through us. In that light, the earlier fear about conquest began to mutate into a different terror. What if the project didn't require chains because it worked through desire? What if the recruitment didn't require force because the human mind, when offered relief from suffering and access to something greater, would walk willingly into the lab? What if the experiment wasn't performed on us the way an experiment is performed on a captive animal, but the way it's performed on a volunteer who signs the consent form without understanding the fine print? And in the background, always, the arrival vectors continued to align. Objects in the sky, once distant anomalies, now visible to the naked eye in some regions, began to hold position in a pattern too disciplined to be natural. The atmosphere itself felt like it carried anticipation, like a stage moments before the curtain rises. Governments offered fewer words. Militaries offered none. The world, stripped of explanations, began to listen for meaning in the only place meaning ever truly forms, inside the human mind. That's when a new rumor spread, one that didn't arrive through satellites or screens, but through whispered certainty. People claimed to hear the same phrase, not with their ears, but as an internal echo that felt oddly universal. We are here. You are ready. Some dismissed it as collective hysteria. Others called it contact. But the most unsettling possibility was that it was neither. That it was a test of readiness. An early phase of synchronization designed to see how quickly a species could accept a shared signal as its own thought. And so the invitation, once framed as a message from the stars, began to reveal its true nature. It wasn't just an announcement of arrival. It was the beginning of integration. The moment Earth was renamed as an operational base, the moment humanity was recategorized as a research subject, the moment the galaxy's coordinated response exposed that 31 Atlas had never been acting alone. Those weren't plot twists. They were the opening moves of a process already underway. A process that didn't ask whether we wanted to join the convergence, because the convergence had already begun inside the architecture of our world and the architecture of our minds. And that leaves the question hanging in the air like a final, unresolved chord. If this is truly a laboratory, then what happens when the experiment reaches its next phase? What happens when transcendence acceleration stops being a theory and becomes an event? Measurable, irreversible, and visible not only in the sky, but in the way you think, the way you remember, the way you say, "I," and mean it? By the time the scientific community finished arguing over what the transmissions meant, the planet had already moved into a new phase of living. Not officially, not with speeches or flags, but with the quiet certainty that comes when a system has been overtaken and everyone can feel it, even if no one can explain it. The strangest part wasn't that our satellites had been hijacked or that our networks had become a cosmic relay. The strangest part was the subtle change in the human atmosphere itself. Conversations stopping mid-sentence, people pausing on sidewalks as if listening for something they couldn't name, entire rooms going silent at the same time, not out of fear, but out of recognition. It was as though the invitation had slipped past the barriers of technology and slipped into the only place it truly needed to reach: the mind. In the earliest hours, it came as noise, an uneasy intuition, a pressure behind the eyes, a sensation that the world was slightly out of alignment. But as the days passed, the noise sharpened into pattern. People reported waking with memories that didn't belong to any ordinary dream, images of star maps and unfamiliar symbols that felt ancient rather than alien. Children began describing the same bright cities in the sky without ever seeing the news. Strangers, separated by oceans, started using identical phrases in casual conversation, as if language itself had been seeded with a script. And in laboratories where the most cautious minds tried to reduce everything to coincidence, the data refused to cooperate. The resonance spikes matched the transmission harmonics too cleanly. The correlations appeared too often. Something was tuning humanity, and it was doing it the way you tune an instrument, patiently, precisely, without asking permission. That was when the phrase, buried in the deeper layers of the signal, "Evolution is not conquest, it is remembrance," took on a meaning far more dangerous than invasion ever could. Because conquest is something you resist, and remembrance is something you surrender to. If the arriving intelligences were truly activating something ancient, then the invitation wasn't offering humanity a new future. It was attempting to unlock an old one, as if our species had been designed with a dormant channel, waiting for the right frequency to wake it. The story of human isolation, of a lonely civilization struggling to figure out the universe, began to look less like a fact and more like a phase, a sleep, a controlled limitation that could be removed when the classroom was ready. As the countdown tightened, the sky itself became less like a ceiling and more like a waiting room. The luminous objects that once appeared as distant anomalies now held position with unnatural stillness, arranged like punctuation marks across the night. Telescopes tracked them, of course, but people stopped needing telescopes to feel their presence. You could sense them in the quiet, moments, the way you sense someone standing behind you before you turn around. And underneath that collective sensation, a deeper unease began to rise. Not the panic of extinction, but the dread of transformation. Because extinction ends the story, transformation rewrites the narrator. It asks the unbearable question: if the I becomes we, If private thought becomes shared signal, if the boundaries of the self dissolve into a wider network, will the person you've always been still exist anywhere inside what comes next? Governments seemed to understand that question long before the public did, and their silence became its own confession. They didn't issue updates because there were no updates to give. The invitation did not come with a negotiation window, it came with a schedule. January 19th, 2026, the first arrivals. February 15th. Phase 1 integration formalized, the beginning of infrastructure that would turn coordination into routine. And then the date that felt like a deliberate twist of symbolism. July 4th. Full synchronization, a holiday of independence repurposed into an announcement that independence itself was being redefined. The message wasn't subtle about what it considered progress. It wasn't interested in whether humanity wanted to remain separate. It was interested in whether humanity was ready to become compatible. And still, woven through the dread, there was a quiet miracle that made everything more complicated. The environmental changes didn't look like invasion scars. They looked like repair. Regions of the planet that had been dying began to show impossible stabilization, as if the very presence of the incoming structures, oceanic, orbital, lunar, was harmonizing systems humanity had spent decades failing to fix. Coral reefs in certain zones began recovering at rates that shouldn't be possible. Atmospheric readings normalized in ways that defied political reality. It was a gift, but a gift that felt like leverage. A benevolent demonstration of capability that asked, without words, do you want to keep suffering under your own limits, or do you want to accept help that comes with a price you don't fully understand? Then came the final development that no instrument could conclusively measure, but no human could ignore. The whisper. Not a sound in the air, not a transmission you could record, but a shared internal message that appeared in minds across continents with eerie consistency. Some heard it during meditation. Some heard it while driving. Some heard it while washing dishes, as if ordinary life had become the perfect doorway for the extraordinary. We are here. You are ready. The words didn't feel like persuasion. They felt like activation, like a key turning in a lock that had always been built into the human psyche. And in that moment, the invitation achieved what no satellite hijack ever could. It became personal. Because once the signal is inside you, the story stops being about what's arriving from space and becomes about what's awakening within humanity. The question is no longer whether Earth was chosen or targeted, celebrated or exploited. The question becomes whether we can carry a wider consciousness without losing the sacred detail of being human, the small loves, the private griefs, the fragile identities that make a life feel like a life. The invitation promises transcendence, but it doesn't clarify what it expects you to leave behind. And as the countdown approaches the first arrival, the world stands at a threshold that feels less like a border and more like a mirror. Because if 31 Atlas was never merely a visitor, if it was a scout preparing a classroom, then the final exam was never going to be fought in the sky. It was always going to be fought in the mind, between the part of us that clings to separation for safety and the part of us that longs to remember what it means to belong to something vast. And when Phase 2 begins, the universe won't need to come to Earth anymore. It will already be within us. When the first arrivals finally moved from approach vectors to presence, the world didn't erupt the way disaster movies taught us it would. There was no single explosion of panic, no universal scream, no mass stampede into chaos. The reaction was stranger, and in a way, far more unsettling. An almost reverent stillness, like a planet instinctively lowering its voice in a cathedral. The objects in the sky didn't tear through the atmosphere with flame and violence. They folded into it, sliding into position with a grace that made every aircraft, every rocket launch, every human attempt at flight suddenly feel crude. They didn't land so much as they arrived, as if gravity itself had been negotiated in advance. And once they were here, the true shift began. Not in the soil, not in the seas, but in the way reality started responding to thought. At first, people tried to interpret the arrival as a spectacle. They stood outside with phones raised, filming lights that refused to look real on camera. The images flattened into something unimpressive, as if the phenomenon resented being reduced to pixels. In person, though, it was different. In person, the light had depth. It felt aware. You didn't watch it so much as you felt it watching back, not with menace, but with the calm curiosity of a scientist examining a living organism. Across the world, reports began pouring in that didn't match any known psychological pattern. Individuals with no spiritual background described an internal opening, like a door in the mind swinging wider than it had ever been. People who had never meditated found themselves slipping into states of silence so profound they could hear their own heartbeat like thunder. And in those quiet moments, something else emerged. A subtle, collective sense that the invitation wasn't simply a message, it was a curriculum. The Convergence classroom didn't look like a school. It looked like a reorganization of the planet's emotional weather. Human life continued on the surface. People went to work, made coffee, fed their children. But everything felt threaded with a new layer of meaning. Conversations became shorter, yet heavier, as if everyone was learning to speak more carefully because words were beginning to carry weight in unfamiliar ways. Arguments lost their momentum, not because conflict vanished, but because the energy behind conflict started to feel exposed, almost embarrassing. People could sense when they were being dishonest, not morally, but vibrationally. The body reacted. The mind reacted. And slowly, the planet began to understand a terrifying possibility. The arriving civilizations were not here to conquer our cities, but to alter the way we inhabit ourselves. The most immediate change was the phenomenon psychologists called resonance synchrony, though the term felt too clinical for what it truly was. It didn't mean you lost your individuality. It meant individuality stopped being a sealed container. Emotions began to leak across the invisible borders between people, not as intrusive noise, but as information. You could walk into a crowded room and feel the collective tension like a pressure wave. You could stand beside a stranger and sense grief sitting behind their smile, not as a guess, but as a certainty. At first, this overwhelmed people. It was like suddenly hearing every instrument in an orchestra at once, without knowing where the melody lived. But then something unexpected happened. Humans adapted. A kind of mental muscle began to form, a skill of filtering, grounding, centering. People learned to hold their own note, even while sensing the larger chord. The motto that emerged wasn't taught by any government or institution. It spread the way instinct spreads. Navigate the we without losing the me. Meanwhile, the infrastructure of the convergence became visible in places no human government controlled. On the far side of the moon, those crystalline arrays finished assembling, blooming like geometric flowers designed for a sun that never shone on them. They didn't feel like buildings. They felt like instruments, enormous tuning forks poised to strike a frequency that would bind minds into a network without requiring bodies to travel anywhere at all. The data describing them called it a bridge, but that word didn't capture the intimacy of the concept. It wasn't a bridge between places. It was a bridge between states. a method of expanding awareness beyond the biological boundary of the skull, beyond the slow limitations of speech and motion. The implication was staggering. Exploration would no longer require leaving Earth. Consciousness itself could become the vehicle, and the universe could be reached by resonance rather than distance. That was the seduction hidden inside the fear. Because a part of humanity, the part that had always stared up at the stars and felt homesick, recognized the beauty of it immediately. To think that our species could join something vast, not as subjects, not as pets, but as participants, was intoxicating. It promised an end to isolation. It promised a new level of intelligence. It promised answers to questions we'd been asking since we first learned to speak. But the other part of humanity, the part that understood history, coercion, and the quiet violence of help offered by the powerful, felt the trap closing. If the invitation was a recruitment, who wrote the terms? If we were being welcomed into a galactic network, would we enter it as equals or as raw material? A rare specimen of emotional complexity harvested for research. That uncertainty deepened as the human interface specialists began their first direct contacts. These weren't meetings in conference rooms. They were conducted in shared mental environments, neutral spaces of pure thought where language wasn't spoken but shaped, where meaning arrived whole without translation. The reports that leaked were frustratingly simple. The beings were patient, and they were waiting for humanity to catch up. They did not threaten. They did not demand. Yet that patience itself carried a quiet dominance, the way an adult's calm patience can dominate a frightened child. It implied a power imbalance so extreme it didn't need to be stated. They could afford to wait because the timetable was not ours. They were not negotiating a future with us. They were supervising a process that had already begun. The deeper humanity moved into this classroom, the clearer it became that the central lesson was not technology, it was coherence. The arriving civilizations did not seem impressed by our machines. If anything, they treated our infrastructure like a set of crude amplifiers that could be repurposed. What they focused on was the human mind, the way it could hold paradox, invent meaning, create beauty out of suffering, imagine worlds that did not yet exist. Those traits were cataloged in the early transmissions as rare, but living through the convergence revealed why. Creativity is unpredictable. Emotion is volatile. Self-awareness is dangerous. Those aren't flaws in a laboratory specimen. They are the ingredients of a consciousness capable of evolving beyond control. And that is where the real tension began to sharpen, like metal cooling into shape. Because the convergence classroom was not simply teaching humanity how to become part of a network. It was forcing humanity to choose what kind of being it wanted to become inside that network. If we surrendered too fully, we risked dissolving into a smooth, efficient collective. Peaceful, yes, but stripped of the sharp edges that make a human life distinct. If we resisted entirely, we risked breaking under the pressure of a reality moving beyond us. The invitation did not present a clean option. It presented a threshold, and thresholds always demand something in exchange. So as Phase 1 integration continued to unfold, the question stopped being whether the universe was coming to Earth. That part was already done. The question became whether humanity could grow large enough to meet the universe without losing itself, whether we could expand into the we while protecting the sacred flame of the I, whether remembrance meant awakening into our true cosmic nature, or simply remembering that we were always meant to be something other than human. And somewhere beneath every anxious thought and every awe-struck stare into the sky, the same quiet realization kept returning, steady as a heartbeat. The invitation wasn't asking us to visit the galaxy. It was asking us to become compatible with it. And here's the truth no one can soften. An invitation like this doesn't arrive as a question. It arrives as a switch being flipped. When 31 Atlas turned Earth's satellites and towers into a single broadcasting engine, it wasn't asking humanity to join the conversation. It was announcing that the preparation phase was finished and that the galaxy answered. The frightening part isn't only the ships in formation or the construction on the far side of the moon. It's the subtle shift beneath everything, the way networks begin to resonate, the way people report the same whisper inside their thoughts, the way reality itself feels tuned to a new cadence. If the signal is right, then this was never just about territory or resources. It's about consciousness, about what we are, what we can become, and what might be lost in the process. So the final question remains, sharp and unavoidable. Are we the chosen ones or the experiment? Maybe it's both. And if evolution is not conquest, it is remembrance. Then Phase 2 won't be decided by weapons or borders. It will be decided by what we agree to become when the universe finally steps close enough to touch our minds.